Hello and welcome back. NAS 4932, Intro to Language Revitalization. For Module 3, Lecture 1, we'll be talking about language documentation. So what is language documentation? Language documentation is the collection, processing, and archiving of linguistic data. So what does that mean? So that means that someone could be a linguist, traditionally has been a linguist, doesn't have to be a linguist, goes to speakers or a speaker of a language, collects examples of the language, and stores that somewhere, whether it be personally storing it with the community, storing it in a larger archive, and just collects and saves information and examples of a language. With the processing part, that can be a lot of different things that we'll talk about throughout this module. So why is language documentation important? Well, number one, to preserve human cultural heritage and information in general. So as languages become endangered and are no longer spoken, with them goes the unique perspectives and unique linguistic forms of that particular language group. And so language documentation is one way to preserve that. It's also a way to keep memory of the facts important for the local communities, families, and individuals. Things like plant names, place names, things like that. It can also be used to better illustrate linguistic theories with real-life observations of language in use. So a lot of the theories about how language in general works comes from European, Asian, and African languages that have been studied intensively. By documenting other languages and languages that are lesser studied, those theories about how language works can be strengthened, modified, or changed to reflect all languages instead of a few very largely spoken languages. And then language documentation is also a way to study language contact. How many words in a particular language come from another language or neighboring languages? Okay, so this is a big quote. Please feel free to pause or read this off the lecture slide. But I found this in a book online called Languages in Danger. Language Documentation is the chapter in that book. And this person, Klessa, is the person who wrote it. If you click on this, it will bring you to the online book. If you click on it in the slide, so you can see the entire chapter, or you can see the entire book right here. That's a additional resource for you. It is not required. No questions from the test will come from this book, but some may come from this paragraph. And so this paragraph talks about the documentation of endangered languages is an especially important and urgent task if we want to at least preserve some of the wealth that these languages possess and that otherwise will soon be gone forever. So I think it's important for you to read this and to understand that many endangered languages don't have a written tradition. And so any data that from these languages may not even exist, or there may be just very little data from these languages. So documenting these languages now is important. So what are some examples of language documentation? So texts, that would be stories, that would be anything that's ever been written in a language if they have a writing tradition. Word lists I think are one of the most common recordings or videos of conversations, traditional stories that have been written down, songs, jokes, fairy tales, just any examples of the language. So, some examples of language documentation through the years, wax cylinders were used to record speakers of languages in the 1800s. If you click on this link, it can bring you to a very famous photo of a native person being recorded by an anthropologist at the Smithsonian Institute in 1916 on a wax cylinder. A lot of these wax cylinders have decayed, and there's been a push to have them transferred to tapes and CDs. Another example would be word list. Even in the 1500s and 1600s, people who were passing through North America wrote down lists of words. And so here you can see a word list from the Delaware language in 1792. There's quite a few that were taken by the French and by the Spanish as well. And then audio and video recordings. There are quite a few audio and video recordings of different languages. And so here is an example that Ho-Chunk Nation elders are recording, making audio recordings of their language. This is as recent as July 2023. To preserve it for future generations. And then stories. So another example is stories. So I say the Nachi example. I have that example right here. So I worked on a program called the Breath of Life. This would have been, I think, 2011 or 2012, I mean. And the Breath of Life is where speakers or community members, I should say, from very endangered language communities or sleeping language communities like the Nachi. Nachi is no longer spoken. The last fluent speaker died in the early 1900s, so this is considered a sleeping language. Come and learn how to use archived language documentation to how to use it in their language revitalization efforts. And so these people from the Nachi, who, if I remember correctly, are citizens of the Muskogee Creek Nation, however, are traditionally Nachi people, came, and we had some traditional stories that we were able to find in the Nachi language that were recorded as linguistic documentation. They were really looking at the structure of the language, not so much trying to preserve the language. But we were able to take that information and repurpose it into, so there was a greeting. So this is how you would say a greeting, and then we had them record it, and so you can click and hear it. I'd have to make it full screen. Well, maybe that link doesn't work anymore. But and here are the stories. And so the story, this is the Nachi language story written with the Muskogee Creek spelling system, orthography. And then we have a version of it in the APA, which is the American Phonetic Alphabet. So this is a phonetic way of saying that same story. And then here is the English translation of that story. And from that, they were able to make like word list if they wanted to make a dictionary. They wanted to make this into a storybook for children, and they had their elder record it. And so that's an example of stories that have been documented. Another great example of language documentation is this movie, The Linguist. In a future module, you will watch this movie. This is a link to the trailer for the movie. But it's about two linguists who are going all over the world to document extremely endangered languages, languages that have like one, two speakers, and just kind of like what it's like for them. Okay, so a major part of language documentation is the ethics of language documentation. And that's something that, to be honest, not enough people think about. So, some ethical questions: who is allowed to document the language? Can anybody off the street document it? Should it be a community member that does that? Should it be a trained linguist? Should it be a partnership? And then once the language is documented, who owns that documentation? And when I say documented language, I don't mean the language so much as the materials that are produced, the recordings, the written documentation. Who has the right to use documented language? I used to work in a archive when I was a grad student at the Sam Noble Museum in Norman, and there were tons of archive materials. However, some language groups did not allow certain people to see them. So some had, you must be a registered tribal member. Some said that you must be able to prove ancestry. Some said you needed explicit permission from the tribe to see them. Some said that no one is allowed to see them. And some said that everyone except so and so, and specifically excluded certain members of their community from being able to see them. And it was the lesson I took from that is very complicated. And we let whoever, or the Sam Noble lets whoever submits the material to be archived write who gets to be able to see it. So a linguist could not just show up and use it. A random person off the street could not just show up and use most of these. Some things were open to general use, but the majority had some level of check. And some seemed, maybe a little too strict. If no one is allowed to see them, then how can that be used? Of course, it's not for us to decide. It was for the community or the person who submitted the materials to decide. Should all types of language be documented? So this is something that has been controversial. Many traditional Native American stories have themes of sex, violence, what would be considered not proper language, maybe even racist language against different groups. So, should everything be documented? And or should it not be? I think a lot of stories and jokes and other things maybe were not documented because it was seen as quote unquote improper. What can be done with the documented language? Does it need to just sit somewhere? Is it supposed to be used for educational purposes like learning and teaching the language? Can it be analyzed by a linguist for, that kind of trying to figure out where it fits into the theories of human language? Who is allowed to be an informant? So, an informant is the person that you document the language from, the person you record or that you copy down the language. So, can any member of a community do that? Should it be older people? Should it be people from a certain community? Maybe people who speak a certain dialect? So, who is allowed to be an informant? And should informants and or the documenters, the people actually doing the documentation, be compensated for their work? There's a tradition in linguistics to compensate informants when possible, and Also, if their material is used in linguistic publications, to cite them as a co-author. This is not a super long-standing tradition, but it was definitely how I was taught, that if I use material from an informant, that they should be my co-author on whatever I produce. And you see that on a lot of dictionaries and other textbooks and other things that linguists have produced. So language documentation methods and techniques. Okay, so the first thing you need to determine if you're going to document language is, what is your goal? Why are you doing this? Yes, the larger goal is to preserve and revitalize a language, but the language that you are documenting today in your session, what is your goal? Are you trying to get material for language classes? Are you trying to gather words for a dictionary? Are you trying to analyze the language like a linguist would to look for certain patterns or certain grammatical features? Are you creating something like a survival guide that can be used right away by community members? A survival guide would be like phrases like, hello, how are you? Give it to me, put it down, things that you can use in your home right away. I'll show examples of this later in the class. I've created a couple survival guides. Or are you trying to do more cultural preservation? Are you trying to save stories? Are you trying to save information about ceremony or prayers, things like that? So for this session, maybe all of these things are a goal, but for the time that you'll be sitting down with your informant, what is your goal? You got to have a plan. Okay, next, what technology do you have access to? Are we writing on pen and paper? If so, you're going to need a standard transcription style like IPA or APA. If you were in the Native American Languages class, then you're familiar with IPA, the International Phonetic alphabet. I showed an example in the Nachi slides of the American phonetic alphabet, which is a variation of IPA that was used mostly in North America in the early 1900s. Are you going to be able to audio record? So do you have a phone or an iPad or an audio recorder? If you didn't know, Nasanti purchased in like 2017 or 2018 some audio recorders that are available in the ECU library. I love these recorders. I use them all the time to record elders, and you could as well. Are you going to video record? If so, do you have a phone or a iPad or a video camera? ECU also has video cameras that you can use to record. I've done audio recording, video recording off of Zoom though as well. So you have like online things you could do. And then do you have some kind of software to be able to edit that audio or video? Audacity is a free software that you can download online. Later in the presentation, I have a link to it. I use Amadeus Pro. This is a paid software that I can do some fun little tricks to, like reducing noise in the background, changing the volume, things like that. iMovie is a free program on all Macs, so if you have access to a Mac computer like the ones in the Digital Humanities Lab at the Lyons-Ketchum Library or through other means, you can use that. And so next, you would want to say what materials already exist. If we are using a informant's precious time to elicit language from them, let's not do what we already have. So if you have word list, if you already have songs, stories, if you already have dictionaries, if you're just looking for them to say these words, then you can easily put together a list of words or the lyrics of a song or the text of a story for them to record. If you're trying to document new language, then you can use these things to record other things. For example, you could go through your dictionary and see what words are missing and just kind of go through the English side and read it and be like, oh, well, we have fork and spoon and knife, but I don't see a word for napkin or for plate or for bowl. Do we have words for that? Let's ask our informant and see if we can get them to record that, and we can add these to the dictionary. The same with, we know that we have this song. What other songs do you know? Or we have these stories. What other stories do you know, that so we can add to these? Okay, so this is my kind of, I have 9 steps here. There's probably more, but this is my personal step by step guide to documenting languages. You will find other kind of methodologies online. I'm sure some very famous linguist has made their own list. This is what I thought of when I was like, okay, how do you do this step by step? Step 1, you want to record everything. Even if you're not using the language, record everything. That way you have a recording. So if something just blurts out, you have that. Step 2, you want to make a documentation agreement. You want to make an agreement with your informant and with the community about everything that they want to happen, that you want to happen, and all be in agreement on that. Then you're going to make a plan. And those are those previous slides, like what are we going to record? What is our goal? What words do we want to use? What are we looking for? You want to prioritize the informant above all else. Most likely they're going to be an elder person, and so they will get tired. They will get frustrated. They may have be missing teeth and are unable to pronounce certain things. Just prioritize the informant above all else. They are much more, the human who is speaking to you is much more important than the language that you are documenting. Make backups. So as soon as your session is done, make a copy and put it somewhere else on a USB drive. My biggest fear would be for my computer to die after I just recorded, tons of language, and then it's gone forever. So make backups. Review your recordings and your documented language. You might be happy with the way it sounds. You may not be happy. You may be frustrated that you didn't get the forms that you were looking for, or that your informant wasn't able to remember certain things. That's fine. Review it so you know what you have, what is good, and what needs help, and then move forward. Don't focus on what is missing. And then use that material that you have documented to create useful products for the community. For example, use the story that has been told to pull out language that could be used in everyday conversation, or use the word list that you have created to go into a dictionary. Use the different terms that were elicited in a storybook or something for language learning. And then once you have created materials and you've reviewed what you've documented, fill in the gaps. Say, look, now we have this, but I think it would be better if we had this information to supplement it. Say, for example, we have a word list of everything in the kitchen. Maybe now we should go back and in our next documentation session, we should get words for the rest of the house. And then just do it all again. Do it over and over and make a plan, and always prioritize your informant. Okay, that is the end of language documentation. Our next lecture is about language description, and that's really what linguists do with documentation beyond making materials for communities.